The FBI was wrong, not about a minor detail or a small procedural question, but about a central piece of physical evidence in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the DNA. This was the evidence that could identify whoever was inside the Tucson home on the morning of February 1st, 2026, and potentially determine who took 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie from her bedroom. Brian Entin had previously raised questions about this aspect of the investigation in his reporting. He repeatedly highlighted concerns that were not being publicly addressed by officials. Now, 86 days into the disappearance, developments have led to public acknowledgement that significant issues occurred in how the DNA evidence was handled, including where it was sent and the impact that decision had on the timeline of the investigation. On February 13, 2026, 12 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Reuters reported that there was disagreement between law enforcement agencies regarding access to evidence. According to a U.S. law enforcement source cited in that reporting, the FBI had requested access to key items from the home, including a glove and DNA samples. The same report indicated that the evidence had instead been sent to a private laboratory in Florida through the Pima County Sheriff's Department. This decision became a central point of scrutiny because it meant that critical biological evidence was not immediately processed at the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, but instead analyzed elsewhere. The sheriff publicly stated that agencies were cooperating and that there was no dispute over evidence handling, while reporting suggested otherwise. These conflicting accounts created early uncertainty about the chain of custody and processing path of the DNA. Forensic experts later commented on the implications of sending complex evidence to a non-FBI facility. One expert, C.C. Moore, described the situation as highly problematic due to the nature of the DNA sample. According to her explanation, the material collected from the scene was not a simple single-source sample, but a mixed DNA profile containing genetic material from more than one individual. This distinction is important because mixed DNA samples require more advanced interpretation methods. In many standard forensic workflows, processing can consume or degrade portions of the sample during analysis. When a sample is complex and no clear profile is obtained, there is limited remaining material for reanalysis if the original sample has already been used. In this case, the initial analysis conducted at the Florida laboratory did not produce a usable identification result. The sample was processed, but no definitive match was generated. As a result, investigators later faced the limitation of working with material that had already undergone testing. Experts noted that the FBI laboratory in Quantico is equipped with more advanced probabilistic genotyping systems designed specifically to interpret complex DNA mixtures. These systems use statistical modeling to evaluate the likelihood of different contributors within a mixed sample. Such tools are not universally available in all private forensic labs. After a period of time, the DNA evidence was transferred to the FBI laboratory at Quantico for further analysis. FBI sources indicated that this transfer included biological materials collected from the home, including items that had previously been processed elsewhere. The FBI later stated publicly that it had requested access to the DNA earlier in the investigation, but that the evidence had initially been routed to a different facility. This clarification effectively confirmed that there had been disagreement over where the evidence should be analyzed and that the FBI's preferred forensic pathway had not been followed at the outset. At Quantico, the DNA is now being processed using advanced forensic methods designed for mixed samples. Additionally, investigators are reportedly considering additional forensic support for other types of evidence, including hair analysis. In some past cases, specialized laboratories have been able to generate DNA profiles from limited or degraded material such as rootless hair, which standard methods cannot always process effectively. Separately, the investigation has involved multiple lines of evidence beyond DNA. These include blood evidence found at the front of the residence, digital data such as phone records and location tracking information, and items collected from the scene for forensic examination. Analysts have examined patterns at the crime scene to assess whether the incident involved one or more individuals, with some interpretations suggesting a single actor based on the distribution of evidence. There are also unresolved questions about other aspects of the investigation. Reports indicate that a vehicle belonging to a family member was held by investigators for an extended period for forensic examination, including analysis of digital systems such as GPS history and connectivity records. The results of these analyses have not been publicly disclosed. Additionally, there were separate reports involving individuals near the neighborhood who claimed they were visited by people identifying themselves as law enforcement conducting investigations. These accounts were later questioned, and their connection to the official investigation remains unclear. Another unrelated development involved internal communications from the local sheriff's department referencing cooperation with a television production in the months prior to the disappearance. While these activities predate the case itself, they became part of broader public scrutiny regarding departmental priorities and operations. As the investigation progressed, the FBI publicly stated that it had sought earlier access to key DNA evidence and that jurisdictional decisions delayed its transfer to federal forensic laboratories. This statement clarified that the initial handling of evidence did not follow the FBI's preferred procedure and contributed to delays in advanced analysis. At present, the primary focus of the investigation is on the forensic analysis being conducted at Quantico. The FBI's laboratory systems are processing DNA evidence using advanced statistical tools designed for mixed genetic profiles. Investigators are also working to integrate other evidence streams, including digital records and physical forensic materials, into a unified analysis. The central question remains unresolved: who was inside the home at the time of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? The DNA evidence, now under federal analysis, is expected to play a key role in addressing that question, either through direct matching in criminal databases or through genealogical reconstruction methods if no immediate match is found. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. The investigation continues across multiple forensic and digital fronts, with federal and local agencies working through evidence that has taken weeks and months to process. The outcome now depends heavily on the results of ongoing forensic analysis and whether it can produce a definitive identification from the materials recovered at the scene. What makes this phase of the Nancy Guthrie investigation so critical is not just that the DNA was delayed, misrouted, or processed in the wrong facility at the wrong time. It is what that delay actually changed inside the case structure itself. Because in modern forensic investigations, time is not just a measurement of urgency, it directly affects what evidence can still be recovered, what comparisons remain valid, and how many investigative paths stay open. By the time the DNA evidence reached Quantico, the investigation was already 70-plus days old. That gap matters in multiple ways that go beyond public perception. First, the biological integrity of evidence does not improve with time once it has been processed, stored, or partially consumed during testing. Even when preserved correctly, repeated handling introduces limitations. Every transfer between facilities increases the risk of degradation, contamination checks, and chain of custody verification requirements. All of that adds procedural time before analysis even begins. Second, investigative momentum is tied directly to forensic output. Early DNA results often shape the entire direction of a case: suspect prioritization, search area refinement, interview strategies, and even digital warrant expansion. When those results are delayed, investigators are forced to rely more heavily on circumstantial evidence, behavioral profiling, and incomplete digital reconstructions. In the Guthrie case, that meant investigators had to build parallel theories without knowing whether the DNA evidence would point toward an unknown intruder, a known individual, or multiple contributors. That uncertainty changes how resources are deployed. At Quantico, the FBI's forensic biology unit began reprocessing the samples using probabilistic genotyping systems. These systems are designed specifically for complex DNA mixtures, the kind that cannot be cleanly separated through traditional STR, short tandem repeat analysis. Instead of trying to isolate a single profile from a mixed sample, probabilistic genotyping evaluates thousands or even millions of statistical combinations. It assigns likelihood ratios to potential contributors and determines how strongly a given profile fits within the mixture. This is not a simple match or no match process. It is a layered statistical model that can sometimes produce results where traditional methods fail entirely. But it requires intact usable data. If key portions of a sample have already been consumed or degraded during earlier analysis, the model has less information to work with. That is why the earlier decision to send the evidence to a facility without these systems became such a central issue in the investigation timeline. Brian Entin's reporting continued to focus on this gap, not just the decision itself, but the downstream effects. His coverage repeatedly highlighted the disconnect between what investigators initially believed the evidence pathway should be and what actually occurred in practice. As federal analysis progressed, attention also shifted toward how DNA evidence would be cross-referenced. If a usable profile is developed, the next step is typically comparison against CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which contains profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in certain jurisdictions, and forensic evidence from unsolved cases. If a direct match is not found in CODIS, investigators then move to familial searching or investigative genetic genealogy. That process uses partial matches to identify relatives of the unknown contributor and then builds family trees to narrow down potential suspects. This is the same general approach used in major cold cases over the past decade, including cases solved through genetic genealogy breakthroughs where traditional investigative methods had failed for years. However, genealogy-based identification requires high-quality DNA data. Even small gaps in the profile can significantly slow down or limit the effectiveness of the process. Inside the Guthrie investigation, this creates a critical dependency. The success of the entire genetic lead now depends on whether the reprocessed DNA retains enough structure to support downstream analysis. While the forensic work continued, investigative teams also focused on integrating non-DNA evidence streams. One of the most important of these is digital location data. Cell tower records collected under the FBI's CAST, Cellular Analysis Survey Team, framework allow investigators to reconstruct device movement patterns around the time of the disappearance. These records can show which phones were present in the area, how long they remained, and whether they moved in coordination with each other. In parallel, digital warrant returns from Google and other providers can establish search histories, geolocation pings, and account access logs tied to specific IP addresses. In many modern investigations, these digital footprints are as important as physical evidence, especially when direct eyewitness accounts are limited. In the Guthrie case, investigators reportedly obtained records tied to the home address and surrounding area during the relevant time window. These records are being analyzed alongside physical evidence to identify overlaps between digital presence and physical activity at the scene. Another major component of the investigation involves behavioral reconstruction. This is where analysts attempt to rebuild the likely sequence of events inside the home based on physical evidence patterns, entry points, timestamps, and injury or blood distribution analysis. Former FBI behavioral analysts, including individuals with experience in violent crime reconstruction, have examined elements of the scene such as blood distribution at the front entrance. Their assessments focus on whether the evidence suggests a controlled abduction scenario or a more chaotic struggle involving resistance at multiple points. Some interpretations suggest that the evidence is more consistent with a single-actor scenario, based on how the victim would have had to be controlled during movement from inside the home to the exterior threshold. The logic behind this interpretation is rooted in spatial limitation. Multiple offenders increase the likelihood of earlier immobilization, which would reduce the chance of movement to the front door area where blood evidence was documented. However, behavioral reconstruction is not definitive proof. It is an interpretive framework used to guide investigative focus rather than confirm identity. What it does provide is structure, and in this case, it reinforces a narrower suspect model that aligns with the idea of a single primary offender. At the same time, investigators have not publicly ruled out alternative scenarios. That is standard practice in active cases where forensic results are still pending. Until DNA confirmation is complete, multiple hypotheses remain open. Public attention has also continued to focus on procedural decisions made early in the investigation. The question of why evidence was initially routed away from the FBI laboratory has become a central point of debate. From an institutional perspective, evidence routing decisions are typically based on jurisdiction, resource allocation, and existing interagency agreements. However, when a case reaches a federal level of complexity, the expectation is often that primary biological evidence will be processed through federal forensic systems to ensure consistency in methodology and access to advanced analytical tools. In this case, the deviation from that expectation created a delay that became highly visible once reported. Brian Entin's role in highlighting this issue has been repeatedly referenced in broader media discussions. His reporting was not limited to the existence of a disagreement between agencies, but extended into documenting how that disagreement affected the timeline of forensic processing. As the investigation progressed, public communication from the FBI became more explicit about the evidence transfer. Senior public affairs statements confirmed that federal agents had requested access to DNA evidence earlier in the timeline and that those requests were not immediately fulfilled. This clarification effectively established a documented timeline: request, denial or delay, private lab processing, and eventual transfer to federal analysis. That sequence is now part of the official investigative record. Meanwhile, law enforcement continues to work through additional evidence streams that have not been publicly detailed in full. These likely include fingerprint analysis, trace fiber comparisons, footwear impressions, and any latent evidence recovered from interior surfaces. Each of these categories contributes to a broader evidentiary picture, but none carry the same identification weight as DNA. That is why the current phase of the investigation is so heavily dependent on Quantico's analysis. If the DNA produces a usable profile, it could generate one of three outcomes: a direct CODIS match, which would immediately identify a known individual; a partial match leading to familial identification, which would initiate a genealogy-based investigation; or no usable result, which would significantly limit forensic identification options and shift the case back toward circumstantial and digital evidence interpretation. Each of these outcomes carries dramatically different investigative consequences. As of now, the FBI has not publicly confirmed which stage of analysis the DNA has reached, only that it is actively being processed. What is clear, however, is that the investigative structure has now fully shifted toward federal forensic control. The evidence is centralized, the tools are more advanced, and the analytical framework is significantly more capable than what was initially used. The unresolved question is whether that shift comes too late to recover what was lost in the first weeks of the investigation. Nancy Guthrie remains missing, the timeline is still open, the forensic analysis is still ongoing, and the investigative outcome now depends heavily on whether the DNA evidence, after weeks of delay, transfer, and reprocessing, can still deliver the identification that investigators have been pursuing since day one. Until that answer arrives, the case remains suspended between two possibilities: a breakthrough driven by advanced forensic science, or a prolonged investigation shaped by early procedural decisions that cannot be undone. And that is where the investigation stands now, waiting on what the DNA will finally reveal. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie does not exist in isolation anymore. At this stage, it has become a convergence point of forensic science, interagency conflict, procedural accountability, and the limits of what delayed evidence can still reveal. Every new development is now being measured against one central question: did the early handling of the DNA permanently reduce what this case can recover, or has federal reanalysis restored that possibility? At Quantico, the reprocessing of the DNA is not a single-step event. It is a layered workflow that unfolds across multiple forensic stages. First, the evidence is assessed for integrity, whether degradation, contamination, or prior consumption during earlier testing has altered its usability. Then it is prepared for extraction, where any remaining biological material is separated and stabilized for analysis. Only after that does the probabilistic genotyping process begin. This is where the real computational complexity of the case emerges. Probabilistic genotyping does not behave like traditional forensic comparison. Instead of producing a single deterministic result, it builds a probability landscape of possible contributors. Each potential DNA profile is evaluated against the mixture, and the system calculates likelihood ratios that express how strongly the evidence supports or excludes each possibility. In practical terms, this means investigators are not waiting for a simple match. They are waiting for statistical confidence levels that may point toward or away from individuals in existing databases. If the profile is strong enough, CODIS will immediately flag a direct hit. But if it is partial or degraded, the system may only produce a partial overlap, which then requires genealogical reconstruction. That process can extend the timeline significantly, sometimes by weeks or months depending on database complexity and family tree depth. This is why forensic timing matters so much in this case. The delay did not just slow down analysis, it potentially shifted the case from a direct identification pathway into a longer interpretive one. While DNA analysis continues, investigators are also refining the spatial reconstruction of events inside the residence. Crime scene analysts use blood distribution patterns, entry and exit trajectories, and environmental markers to establish a timeline of physical interaction. In this case, the blood evidence at the front entrance has been repeatedly analyzed because it represents one of the clearest physical indicators of a struggle occurring at the threshold of the home. The placement, directionality, and dispersion of the blood droplets suggest movement from inside toward the exterior, consistent with a transition point rather than an isolated interior incident. Behavioral analysts interpret this kind of pattern as indicative of a forced or controlled movement scenario. However, interpretation depends heavily on context, and without corroborating forensic confirmation, it remains a structured hypothesis rather than a conclusion. What strengthens the single-actor theory in this investigation is not just the blood pattern itself, but the logistical constraints of controlling an 84-year-old individual during movement through a confined residential entry point. Analysts have pointed out that managing such movement under resistance typically reduces spatial dispersion unless multiple individuals are involved. The presence of controlled directional movement toward the exit has therefore been incorporated into the working behavioral model. At the same time, investigators are cautious not to overinterpret any single piece of physical evidence. Modern forensic practice emphasizes convergence. Conclusions are only strengthened when multiple independent evidence streams point in the same direction. That is why digital evidence has become equally important in this case. Cellular data, for example, provides a time-stamped environmental map of device activity around the residence. CAST analysts can reconstruct movement arcs of mobile phones in the vicinity, identifying patterns such as stationary presence, synchronized movement, or anomalous signal drops that may indicate device switching or intentional interference. In parallel, digital warrant returns from technology providers offer another layer of reconstruction. These can include location history, account logins, and search behavior tied to specific IP addresses. When aligned with physical timelines, they help establish behavioral context for individuals connected to the investigation. However, none of this digital evidence directly identifies a suspect on its own. It functions as corroboration, not confirmation. That is why DNA remains the anchor point of the entire investigation. Without a genetic identification, every other evidence stream remains interpretive. With it, the case can shift from reconstruction to attribution. This is the reason the initial lab decision continues to be examined so closely. The decision did not just affect timing, it affected sequencing. Evidence that might have produced early leads instead became part of a delayed forensic cycle, meaning investigative decisions made in February and March had to proceed without the clarity that DNA might have provided. Inside law enforcement analysis circles, this is often described as a lead inversion problem. Instead of DNA guiding the investigation had to proceed in parallel until DNA could catch up. That inversion changes everything. Suspect prioritization, interview sequencing, and resource allocation all become less precise when the strongest forensic tool is not yet available. As the FBI continues its analysis, another layer of complexity is being added through genetic genealogy preparedness. If CODIS does not produce a direct match, investigators may transition to familial searching, which uses shared DNA segments to identify relatives of the unknown contributor. From there, genealogists construct family trees using public records, historical data, and demographic mapping. This process can narrow down a suspect pool from thousands to a handful of individuals. However, it is time-intensive and depends heavily on the quality of the DNA profile. Even small gaps or missing markers can significantly increase the complexity of reconstruction. This is why forensic experts have repeatedly emphasized the importance of sample integrity in the early stages of processing. Once certain biological material is lost, it cannot be reconstructed. While forensic work continues, public scrutiny around the investigation's procedural history has also intensified. The early disagreement over where evidence should be processed has become a focal point for accountability discussions within law enforcement oversight channels. From an institutional standpoint, such disagreements are not uncommon in multi-jurisdictional cases. However, when they involve high-value biological evidence in an active missing person investigation, the consequences become far more visible. FBI communications later clarified that federal agents had requested access to DNA evidence earlier in the investigation timeline, but that the material was instead routed through a different forensic pathway. This clarification established a documented delay between request and federal analysis. That delay is now part of the official investigative record. At the same time, investigators are continuing to evaluate additional physical evidence categories that have not been fully disclosed to the public. These likely include latent fingerprints, trace fibers, and footwear impressions collected from the residents. Each of these evidence types contributes to the broader reconstruction model, but none carry the same individual identification power as DNA. Fingerprints can be smudged or partial, fibers can be transferred indirectly. Footwear impressions can indicate presence but not identity. DNA remains the only forensic category capable of definitively identifying a person beyond reasonable doubt. This is why so much weight now rests on Quantico's analysis. If the DNA produces a usable profile, the investigation could move rapidly into identification and confirmation phases. If it does not, the case will rely far more heavily on circumstantial convergence, digital reconstruction, and behavioral modeling. Neither path is simple, but they differ significantly in certainty and timeline. There is also the unresolved question of whether earlier handling of the evidence permanently limited its potential. Some forensic experts caution that once a complex mixed sample has been partially consumed or processed without modern probabilistic tools, certain informational layers may be irretrievably lost. Others argue that advancements in forensic computation now allow recovery of usable profiles even from degraded or previously tested samples. The truth in this case will only be determined by the output of the current analysis. What remains constant is the human dimension of the investigation. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. Her disappearance has triggered one of the most closely followed forensic investigations in recent memory, not only because of the circumstances of the case itself, but because of the visible tension between procedural decision-making and scientific capability. Every stage of the investigation now feeds into a single narrowing corridor, identification of the person or persons responsible, and that narrowing is now being driven almost entirely by what emerges from the DNA at Quantico. Until that analysis produces a definitive result, the case remains open in its most literal sense, waiting for science to close the gap that time and procedure have widened. The next update in this investigation will not come from speculation or reconstruction. It will come from the DNA itself, and when it does, it will determine whether this case shifts toward resolution or remains suspended in uncertainty.